Been in office for 100 days, so we continue to unpack what happened so far during this 100 days. Now with political analyst Professor KWANDIWE KONDLO, he's of the University of Johannesburg. Now he joins me in studio. Prof, thank you very much for making time. Well, 100 days, not so much, more especially when talking economic matters. What has been your assessment of the man in the past 100 days?
I would, to be very frank, I think he represents our hope. He represents the hope of many South Africans that tomorrow will be better than today.
Yeah.
And his presidency actually emerges in a very difficult context. I talk about context both internationally and even nationally. What makes the context difficult nationally is what seems to be the crisis within the ANC.
Yes.
The ANC which he inherited, he took over from Mr. Zuma. That organization still has to sort itself, and he's at the helm. Nationally, talking about the country as a whole, I would say the first 100 days, he has done very well. I'm not trying to be very lenient to him, but given the circumstances, the man has done very well. He has proved that, number one, as a leader, you don't have to, dance to the music of certain people who can go to the media, write articles. You must do what you think is right and take the required time to do what you think is right. We have seen how he dealt with the Northwest debacle.
Yes.
And we saw how he dealt with the exit of Mr. Zuma, because that also required a lot of persuasion, skill, and strategy.
Yes.
And he actually displayed very excellent interpersonal, persuasive strategies which a leader actually requires. So at a national level, even though there is nothing really concrete which has changed, especially at the level of the economy, but you can see the signals Mr. Ramaphosa is sending out, both to the country nationally and to the world, are very good signals. But of course, at the international front, he's going to be faced with a serious hurdle, and the serious hurdle is the trade war led by Mr. Donald Trump.
How? See, I'm happy I'm talking to a scholar here. How then do you navigate yourself as a president of South Africa? You are creating all this hope for the domestic markets, but internationally you are associated with BRICS, which is aligned to some of the fierce opponents of the US, yet you still cannot ignore Trump.
Unfortunately, the global political economy, it's so inextricably interlinked and integrated. And unfortunately, South Africa is part of it, fortunately or unfortunately. South Africa is part of it. And Mr. Ramaphosa will need to navigate and walk very carefully, because number one, he doesn't want to drive away foreign direct investment. Whether it's coming from the Brexit or it's coming from the European Union, but he doesn't want to drive away investors. And secondly, he needs to be careful about the fact that he must not be seen to compromise on issues which South Africa is traditionally known to stand for, especially in the area of international relations. The defense for human rights, the defense for global governance which is just and equitable. So he needs to really balance his act, because he needs these guys to come and invest into the South African economy. The trade war itself, led by Mr. Trump, unfortunately, it doesn't matter what Mr. Ramaphosa does. South Africa is going to be affected by that. There's going to be the downside of it, which actually overshadows the upside, the benefits that South Africa might get. The downside of it is that we're still not sure the ripple effects of the trade war, especially the tariff increase in steel and aluminium.
Yes.
What impact is this going to have on South African manufacturing? There is going to be effect, definitely. Loss of jobs, yes. And of course, the retaliatory tariffs by China on American agricultural products could actually end up a boost for South African wine and other agricultural products. But that boost is going to be minimal compared to the losses that are going to be inflicted by job losses in manufacturing.
Can South Africa reposition itself to be the #1 state on the continent? And if so, well, we're no longer talking 100 days here. We're now talking perhaps even the legacy of the man. What does he need to do?
It's going to be quite difficult. And remember, global political economy, including African political economy, it's now characterized by complexity, uncertainty, and also a lot of anxiety. African powers also jostle for that #1 position in the continent. You have Egypt, which is recovering and coming very well, and you also have Nigeria, whose growth and development path is uncertain, but it's a huge economy. And you have South Africa right down in the south, which is seen by many as a gateway into the African markets. Whether Mr. Ramaphosa really will uphold and maintain the integrity which South Africa has enjoyed during the time of Mandela, during the time of Mbeki, and of course there was a slump during the time of Mr. Zuma. So Mr. Ramaphosa is sort of rebuilding the integrity that we have enjoyed. But I am confident that he's gonna take us a step further. But of course with him, I'm not expecting what one would call a leadership paradigm shift. I don't think we'll find that with Mr. Ramaphosa. Mr. Ramaphosa is going to continue almost along similar lines to Mr. Mbeki. His approach to economics and development, I still think, the way I see him in the 100 days, is that it's going to be urban-centric. Whereas in South Africa, we need a change of paradigm. We need a leadership which sees and emphasizes rural economic growth rather than urban economic growth. I'll tell you why. If you look at the survey which was conducted between 1951 to 1994, its findings are still undisputable in the sense that what comes out of that survey, it shows that rural economic growth has more strong spillover effects on poverty in general. Rural economic growth actually reduces urban poverty. But our emphasis has always been on urban economic development. And rural economic growth, it's something none of our leaders has managed to emphasize.
How does, you're bringing in a very interesting point now. How does a better rural economy impact on the urban one?
A better rural economy, especially if you can take, for example, in agriculture. It creates a better food basket for the poor in rural areas. It creates more job opportunities in rural areas, and people don't have to move all the way, shift poverty burden to urban centers. You see? And that is what we need to do in South Africa if we want to deal with the burden of poverty and unemployment, confront the legacy of Bantustans. Because the Bantustans, former Bantustans, are still a drag on South Africa's economic growth. And that has not been confronted by any of our leaders.
Now, does this have to extend to the SADC community? Because South African economy either relies heavily on, well, if you look at, for instance, the mining sector, the labor force there, it's Lesotho, Mozambique, and the neighboring countries, and, for instance, the rural population within South Africa. Does President Cyril Ramaphosa have to also ensure that the neighboring countries' economies are improved so that they do not become a burden to his economy?
Absolutely. I think that's one of the issues Mr. Ramaphosa needs to look into as he deals with his SADC colleagues. Because really, the kind of interdependence that you find in the SADC, it's South Africa which is always dominating.
Yes.
Yes. And really, to make sure that when they meet as SADC, they encourage economic growth in all member states, and they all focus on their rural economies. That could actually improve the economies you find within SADC.
What should happen to SACU? Because somehow I'm not so sure they've really been able to live up to expectations.
SACU continues to exist, and it has existed for quite some time. And South Africa again is still the leading voice. To be honest, I really don't know what or where Mr. Ramaphosa should start to turn things around within SACU and make that organization more dynamic and more relevant to the needs of the population.
Because I'm wondering personally, has it really been helpful to this region? Because I mean, we have had talks over time of this common currency, let's allow free movement in the region, and economic movement, and alignments and all that. But I'm not seeing it happening. It would appear SACU is heavily reliant on South Africa.
Yeah. And unfortunately, it's just like that. It's just like that. You see, I think one of the major problems you find in the economies of countries within SADC and also members of SACU is that their economies are to a large extent very externalized. Externalized in the sense that even their elites, rather than investing in their domestic economies, they actually invest outside. You see? And that is a big, it's a legacy problem that you find in Southern Africa. And Mr. Ramaphosa, brilliant and good and courageous as he is, I really don't expect him to perform miracles. Some of these things are actually going to take time before they change.
And you look at the stability, the political stability which impacts heavily on the economies of, we can just pick Zimbabwe, Mozambique, Swaziland, and of course Lesotho. South Africa is again bearing the brunt there.
Yes, it is bearing the brunt. And Zimbabwe, we hope that very soon probably we're going to see some improvement. And but with other countries like Swaziland, Lesotho, and others, I think this whole historical trajectory of single commodity dependence for exports and the weaknesses you find in their currencies, and in some instances weak political institutions, these continue to make these countries heavily dependent on South Africa. So the relationship of interdependence, it's not at equal levels. Yes, these countries depend more on South Africa than South Africa depends on them.
Now, Prof, if I were to, let's get our wish list correct here. If I were to get you an audience with President Ramaphosa, what would you want to tell him?
What would I like? What would I want to tell him? I would actually talk to him about paradigm change in political leadership. That rather than bagging foreign direct investment and rather than being so urban-centric, let the paradigm change. Let us emphasize now rural economic growth, because that's where, if you sort out the issue of poverty in rural areas that has positive spin-offs for urban poverty. If you sort out the situation of rural areas, you actually even reduce that rural-urban migration, which ends up shifting the burden of poverty from rural areas to urban areas. I would actually ask him to also look at the way how he identifies people to serve in his cabinet. It's going to be very important that we don't get in cabinet people who become political principals in certain departments because they get along with the president. Mm-hmm. But we need political principals who have knowledge. Let us restore the authority of knowledge to the center of policy making.
Prof, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.
I really appreciate it. Professor KWANDIWE KONDLO there. Now let's move on. As the Department of Social Development marks the launch of Child Protection Week, Gauteng Department of Education says it will investigate